Banks have already made their decision. The debate you keep seeing online about whether XRP is real or just hype, that debate ended in the boardrooms a long time ago. It's just not over yet on your timeline, and most retail investors won't realize that until it's already priced in. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The same institutions that are supposed to be terrified of crypto replacing their slow, expensive payment rails are the ones quietly wiring Ripple's infrastructure into their own systems, right now, while staying almost completely silent about it in public. So here's the real question nobody wants to ask out loud. If banks genuinely believed XRP was nothing, a fad, a meme with a market cap, why would more than 30 of the largest financial institutions on Earth already be connected to Ripple's network behind the scenes? Now, I'm Alina, and around here we talk about wealth. Go ahead and like this video and subscribe right now if you haven't already, because I'm going to walk you through exactly what's happening inside these institutions and why it matters more than almost anything else in the XRP space right now. And before we go further, know that this is not financial advice. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. Always do your own research. Drop in the comments and tell me, did you already know banks were this deep into Ripple's network, or is this the first time you're hearing it? I want to know how wide the gap is between what's actually happening and what most people think is happening. Because right now, that gap is enormous. Let's restate the tension in plain terms, because I don't want you walking away from this video with a vague feeling. I want you walking away with the actual mechanics, the names, and the receipts. SWIFT, the messaging system that basically every bank on the planet uses to move money internationally, just unveiled a new framework. It connects more than 50 banks across over 25 payment corridors, with the first wave going live by the middle of this year. And when people actually looked at the list of participating banks, something strange jumped out. At least 30 of those 50-plus banks are already connected to Ripple in some form. We're talking about names like Santander, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, and JPMorgan. SWIFT didn't mention Ripple once in its announcement, not once. But the overlap is too big to be a coincidence, right? These are not small regional banks experimenting on the side. These are the institutions that move the global economy, and they are sitting in both rooms at the same time, the SWIFT room and the Ripple room, without telling either room what they're doing in the other. Here's the thing that makes this so interesting. Most of these banks are using RippleNet, which is the messaging and settlement layer, and that doesn't automatically mean they're using XRP itself. RippleNet can run entirely in fiat currency if a bank wants it to. Only a portion of RippleNet partners, somewhere around 40% based on what's publicly known, actually flip the switch and use on-demand liquidity, which is the product that requires XRP as the bridge asset between currencies. So the honest answer is, not every bank on that list is touching XRP directly today. But that's actually the part that should make you pay attention, not relax. Because the infrastructure is already installed, the relationship is already built, the compliance teams have already done the hard part, which is getting comfortable with Ripple as a counterparty. Flipping from messaging only to actually settling in XRP is not a 5-year decision at that point. It's a settings change. Let me give you a picture that makes this click, because numbers and bank names can start to blur together if I don't anchor it to something real. Think about how a restaurant tests a brand new dish. They don't put it on the public menu the day they think of it. They test it quietly in the back kitchen, after hours, when customers aren't watching. The chefs taste it, adjust the seasoning, throw out 3 versions that didn't work, and only after it's been through dozens of silent trial runs does it ever show up on a menu with a price next to it. By the time you, the customer, ever hear about that dish, the testing phase has been over for months. The restaurant already knows it works. They're not experimenting anymore when they finally announce it. They're just telling you what they already proved to themselves in private. That is exactly what's happening with banks and XRP right now. The back kitchen is real. JPMorgan, working through its Connexus platform alongside MasterCard's multi-token network and a firm called Ondo Finance, recently completed something genuinely historic: a cross-border settlement of a tokenized US Treasury fund that ran directly on the XRP ledger. The transaction settled in under 5 seconds, outside of normal banking hours, in a process that would have taken 1 to 3 business days through old-fashioned correspondent banking. JP Morgan delivered actual US dollars into Ripple's own bank account in Singapore to make it happen. That is not a press release about exploring blockchain. That is one of the largest banks on the planet putting real money through XRP ledger rails and proving the plumbing works. And they didn't throw a parade about it. It came and went through trade publications, mentioned almost in passing, the way a chef might mention what they tried in the kitchen last Tuesday. And it's not just JPMorgan. Cross River Bank has actually been running on Ripple's protocol quietly for more than a decade, handling real time cross border payments between the United States and Western Europe the entire time, with almost nobody outside the industry ever talking about it. This year, Cross River became the deposit holding bank for Elon Musk's new X Money platform, a payments product aimed at hundreds of millions of users. Nobody has confirmed publicly whether XRP itself will move through X Money's infrastructure, but think about what it means that Ripple's oldest and quietest US banking partner just became the deposit bank for one of the most watched fintech launches of the entire year. That's not a coincidence either. Meanwhile, over in Asia, SBI Holdings, one of Japan's largest financial groups, has spent years building out XRP based remittance corridors across Southeast Asia, and recently clarified that its stake in Ripple is a real equity position, not just a pile of tokens sitting in a wallet. These are not press release partnerships announced with confetti. These are operational relationships that quietly keep running in the background year after year, while the rest of the world argues about price targets on social media. So let's go back to that kitchen one more time, because there's a second layer to this analogy that matters just as much. Sometimes a restaurant doesn't just test a new dish, it renovates the entire kitchen to be able to cook things it couldn't cook before. That's what's happening with Ripple's regulatory status in the United States. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the federal regulator that oversees national banks, conditionally approved something called Ripple National Trust Bank. Ripple is in the process of becoming a federally regulated banking entity, not a full commercial bank that takes your deposits and gives you a debit card, but a trust bank that can custody digital assets and handle settlement under direct federal oversight. The OCC's broader rule change, which expanded exactly what these new style trust banks are allowed to do, officially took effect this spring. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how seriously the old guard is taking this. The Bank Policy Institute, which represents JPMorgan, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup, has reportedly been weighing legal action against the OCC over these very charters. Think about that for a second. The biggest banks in the country are considering suing a federal regulator because a crypto native company got a banking license. You don't sue someone over something you think is irrelevant. You sue them when you're worried about losing ground to a competitor who just got institutional legitimacy you don't yet have. And underneath all of that sits the real prize Ripple is chasing, which is a Federal Reserve master account. If that gets approved, Ripple would gain direct access to the same payment rails that JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America already use to move money inside the Fed system itself. That would make Ripple the first crypto native company in history with that kind of access. Most of the immediate benefit there flows to Ripple's stablecoin, RLUSD, not directly to XRP token demand. I want to be honest with you about that distinction, because a lot of channels blur it to make the story sound bigger than it is. But here's why it still matters for XRP holders specifically. Every on-demand liquidity transaction that moves through Ripple's network still uses XRP as the bridge asset in the middle. The more legitimate, the more federally regulated, the more too big to ignore Ripple becomes as a banking entity, the lower the remaining excuse for risk-averse compliance departments to avoid plugging into ODL. The kitchen isn't just testing recipes anymore. It's getting a health inspector's seal of approval that lets it serve dishes it legally couldn't serve before. I want to pause here because if you've been holding XRP through years of sideways price action, waiting for exactly this kind of institutional validation, you already understand why this matters more than another speculative headline. This is the quiet, boring, unglamorous infrastructure work that actually moves an asset from interesting experiment to load-bearing part of the global financial system. It doesn't trend on social media the way a price prediction does, right? Nobody makes a viral video out of an OCC rule change. Nobody screenshots a settlement report from JP Morgan's Kinex's platform and posts it with a rocket emoji. But 5 years from now, when people look back at what actually made XRP indispensable, it won't be the tweets. It will be moments exactly like this one. Quiet settlements, quiet charters, quiet plumbing being laid behind closed doors while most retail investors were busy watching candlesticks. Now, here's my honest personal opinion, and I say this knowing some people will disagree with me. I don't think most banks are testing XRP because they're excited about crypto as some kind of revolution. I think they're testing it because they're scared of being last. There's a very specific kind of fear that runs through traditional finance, and it isn't the fear of change. Banks have survived plenty of change. It's the fear of being the only major institution that didn't have the infrastructure ready when the rest of the industry moved. Nobody wants to be the bank holding a fax machine when everyone else already has a phone. That fear is exactly why you see institutions quietly building Ripple connections while publicly staying neutral or even dismissive about crypto in interviews. They are hedging, they are buying optionality. They are making sure that if XRP and Ripple's rails do become the new standard for cross border settlement, they're not starting from zero when that moment arrives. That's not blind faith in crypto, that's risk management. And honestly, risk management from people who move trillions of dollars is a far stronger signal than another influencer telling you XRP is going to the moon. You can actually watch this fear play out in real time if you look at where Ripple is expanding right now. The company recently moved to deepen its presence in Brazil, rolling out a combined offering of cross border payments, crypto custody, brokerage, and treasury tools for banks and fintechs in the region, and applying for a formal license with Brazil's central bank to operate under the country's new crypto framework. Brazilian institutions like Banco Genial are already using Ripple's rails for same-day dollar transfers, and other regional banks have issued their own stablecoins directly on the XRP ledger. Latin America isn't a side project for Ripple. It's one of the clearest real-world proving grounds for exactly the kind of quiet institutional testing we're talking about. Every region where this happens quietly, without headlines, adds another brick to the same foundation. Now, here's the deeper reason this all matters to you personally. And it's not just about believing in the technology, it's structural, the same way it always is with this kind of slow moving institutional shift. If even a fraction of the volume currently moving through old correspondent banking, a system that ties up an estimated $27 trillion in parked liquidity worldwide just sitting in pre funded accounts waiting to settle transactions, starts shifting toward on demand liquidity, the bridge asset standing in the middle of that flow benefits from sheer transaction volume alone. You don't need every bank to commit publicly tomorrow. You need the back kitchen testing to keep quietly succeeding deal by deal, settlement by settlement, the way the JPMorgan MasterCard Ondo transaction just did. That is not a guarantee of price. I'm not promising you a number. I'm just showing you the mechanics of why patient holders are positioned closer to the center of this story than most people currently realize. And once you start thinking about your position this way, as something tied to actual institutional infrastructure rather than headline noise, the next decision that matters is how you protect whatever growth eventually comes from it. Because here's what quietly undoes years of patient positioning for so many investors. You can do everything right. You can hold through the boring stretches, ignore the noise, resist the urge to trade every headline, and then the moment finally comes where this asset reprices in a meaningful way. And the second you go to take profit in a regular taxable brokerage account, a large chunk of what you waited years for gets handed straight to the tax system. All that patience, all that conviction, and a stranger still shows up at the end to take a cut of the reward you earned by staying in when almost nobody else would. So let's bring this all the way back together. Banks are not loudly announcing a crypto revolution, and they're probably never going to. That's not how institutions behave. What they're doing instead is quietly building the pipes, quietly getting the regulatory charters, quietly running real settlements through XRP ledger rails, and quietly positioning themselves so they're not caught flat footed if this becomes the new standard for how money moves across borders. The kitchen is testing the dish. The health inspector just signed off on a renovated kitchen that's allowed to cook more than it could before. And the people who actually understand what's happening aren't the ones checking the price every hour. They're the ones who already know why the back kitchen activity matters more than this week's candle. Whatever happens to the price next month, the infrastructure being built right now doesn't get undone overnight. So drop in the comments and tell me honestly, does it surprise you how deep banks are already wired into Ripple's network? Or did you already suspect something like this was happening behind closed doors? I genuinely want to know whether this community is ahead of the news cycle or whether most of us are still catching up to it, because I think a lot of XRP holders have a gut feeling about this that they've never actually seen confirmed with real names and real transactions until now. Tell me which name on this list surprised you the most. Was it JP Morgan? Was it SBI? Or was it something else entirely? Like this video if it gives you a clearer picture of what's actually happening underneath the surface, and subscribe if you haven't already. And send this to someone who keeps dismissing XRP without ever having looked at what the banks themselves are quietly doing. And as always, I want you to stay wise, stay wealthy, and I'll see you in the next video.